Hi, this is a video where we'll look at using the bullet solver in Maya to do rigid body dynamics rather than soft body dynamics that you can do with something like nCloth. So just be aware, first of all, that at least in this iteration of Maya, the bullet solver system is not related to the nucleus solver in any way. So you can't have it interact with nucleus nodes, and cloth and hair and particles and so on, as far as I'm aware. So what we want to do today is make something like this where we have a collection of objects. We're going to drop them into a bowl. We're going to move the bowl to spill out the objects. So something like this. So obviously there's gravity in the scene, and we can animate the collision object to dump out these objects. Now I have to say that this one works, but I've tried this many times where it doesn't work very well. And I'm not sure why, except that it just seems to be a bit finicky about how you set things up. So I'm going to kind of set it up in an ideal sort of situation, although I'm going to introduce a way to use mesh to create your duplicates. At any rate, let's take a look at how we do this. So I'm just going to create a new file. I'm not going to save this scene. And let's look first at creating the cubes. So you could do it just by, duplicating. And in some ways that might be a safer way to do it. I'm not sure. But let's just look at using mesh. So if I just take this polycube and delete its history, freeze its transformations, and I'll go to the mesh node to create mesh network, and we need a mesh in a grid. Apply. Go to distribute and just give ourselves some more. So if you're not familiar with mesh, there's lots of tutorials out there about this. So I'll just make a little collection, so 4x4x4. So I've got 16 times 4, so I've got 64 cubes here. And now we don't really want the mesh network, but we want to reproduce this repro mesh that's generated by the mesh network. So I can just duplicate like normal, just Command D on the Mac. Actually, now I'm just going to delete this. What you might be tempted to do, and maybe there's a way to make this work, but I haven't figured it out yet. One of the good things about mesh is that we potentially could go into our mesh waiter and add another node, like a random node, for example. So I could just add some randomness to the rotation of all these things. So they start off in the sort of less perfect layout, and which might give more interesting dynamics. However, what I found is that if we apply a bullet node to this now, or a bullet solver as an active rigid body, it's not really going to take the orientation of these things into account. So I think it's better if you start out with things organized just in a regular way like this, and let bullet have them distributed in a weird way when they fall, in a more random way when they fall into the bowl in this case. So again, we'll just select this and duplicate it. So we've got a duplicate of the repro mesh, and I'm just going to get rid of the original repro mesh, and that'll get rid of the mesh. And now this thing, I want to delete the history, freeze transformations, and you'll note that it's all just one object right now. So if I select this and go to mesh, separate, it'll break it into individual objects. So separate will simply find discrete parts of a single shape node, so discrete in space, and separate them into distinct objects. But you'll notice that the pivot point for all of them is at the center of the world, which is no good. That will mess up the solving when we convert it to a dynamic rigid body. So we can just select all of these things, go to modify and center pivot, And everything is good. Now if we select any of them, the pivot should be in the center of the object. Good. So we'll select all of these, delete history, freeze transformation. So you'll notice I've got shortcuts for these because I use them all the time. But delete history is under edit and modify for freeze transformations. Okay, so now we've done this. You'll also notice it's in a group here. I don't know if this matters, but I like to take it out of the group. It's got all the poly surfaces in here. So I'm just going to select the group and go to edit, ungroup. I'm going to delete the history again on all these objects. And let's look at their transformations. Where are they? Yeah, so their transformations are still frozen. There's nothing in its translate, rotate, or scale. They're all named polysurface. Let's rename them. So we'll just go up to our little master renamer up here. Call these cubes. Or cube underscore. Okay, good. Things are nice and tidy. Now everything is organized. So this is a good time to save your file because it is crashy. So we've got these. We're going to go into our effects menu, and here's bullet. So if you don't see bullet, just like anything else in Maya, if it's based on a plugin and you don't see it, you go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, and find the bullet plugin and make sure it's loaded and auto-loaded. There's another one called ABC Bullet. Don't know what that does. Very helpful. Thank you. ABC usually refers to something that's in the limbic cache, so maybe it has something to do with caching out bullet. I don't know. So let's do this without the bowl first. So if we select all these and we go to bullet, we could turn these into active rigid bodies. So we want them to be active because they have to move and respond to forces and collide with objects and change their position. A passive rigid body would be something that can be collided with but would not have its position changed or its rotation, any of its transformation attributes. But to make it easier on ourselves, we can create a rigid set since we've got a whole bunch of objects. So this will automatically create an active rigid body for each one of these things, but only one set of settings that we need to adjust in order to make changes to it, whereas using the other way would have settings for each one of these cubes. All right, so apply and close, good. Now let's see what else does it add into our scene here. So here's a bullet solver. Nothing to see here, but if we look at it in the attribute editor, just like a nucleus solver, you can enable it or disable it. For some reason, it always starts at 1.25. It's probably in the default settings. I didn't change anywhere. So I changed this to 1, that frame. We can look at this stuff later, but it's got built-in gravity. You can use Maya fields with it, but I've had mixed success with this. And what else? Collision filters. We can turn on the collision shape here, and you can see it matches the shape of this perfectly because these are just simple boxes. So it might be a little different depending on what shape your objects are. And we'll look at that in a second. Bullet solver. So we've got the bullet rigid set initial state. So we've got the rigid attributes, so the mass, damping, friction, restitution. Initial conditions. Never sleeps, initially sleeping. So when you turn on initially sleeping, it means they won't move until a force is applied to them. So that's useful if you're making something that has to be struck by something else before it will it will act like an active rigid body. You can glue them together and have a threshold. So if you have a model that you break into lots of pieces using something like Maya Shatter, and then you can turn them all into rigid bodies, glue them together, make them initially sleeping until a spaceship crashes into them or something. Collision attributes. Now this is important. So the collision shape type for this box obviously works well. But if you have something that's more spherical, you can use that. Capsule, cylinder. There's hull, and I'm not sure exactly what this is, but I think it has to do, I think this would match the shape a little more closely, but it's not an exact shape match. So the collision shape is not going to be exactly the same as your object, at least for an active rigid body. So usually that's okay, and probably the one that matches closest if you have something more complex would be hull, but you can select among these. Other things, don't know. So we've made this. Now if we go into the bullet solver node, I just want to turn on ground plane so it's got something to strike without making another collision object. So if we drop these now, right? So that's good. Happy with that. Just giving myself some more frames. Now if you play the, oh, don't go backwards. If you play this and weird things happen, like they spin or they don't settle or something like that, what I've found causes that sometimes is if you did not center the pivot of each of these objects, because then it's treating its pivot as being somewhere other than itself. So you can see the pivot of the bullet solvers down here, but I mean the pivot for each of these cubes. So also, if it's not acting in the way that you would expect, you can try changing this internal fixed frame rate. So it's at 60 hertz by default. You can change it to 120 hertz, 240 hertz. And this has to do with, so it's a frequency, right? So this is kind of how frequently it's checking the position of these things. And sometimes these can give better results, but they'll often give kind of different results too. Or it may crash. So I am going to save my file and play it at 120 hertz. Right, so you can see different results here at 120 hertz. 240 hertz. Totally different results, right? So it's not allowing them to fall down. Why is this happening? Ask one of the bullet designers. I have no idea. But I have used this in the past when I've had a problem with them not settling down when they fall, and that can help. What does split impulse mean? Well, that can happen if your initial objects are colliding with each other in their initial state. And if that happens, they will shoot each other away from one another, because it will, as soon as you start playing, they'll say, we're colliding, and they will push them away from each other. If you turn on split impulse, it will ignore that initial collision and then play out the animation first. So that's useful. Other things here, yeah, okay. Who can know what all of these settings mean? It's a mystery. All right. So this is good. 60 hertz one works well. Evidently, you can use your GPU or your CPU to help accelerate the solver. Let's try it. CPU. OpenCL is not enabled in this version of the plugin. Okay, seems exactly the same to me. Okay, what's next? Well, now we don't want to just collide with the floor. We want to collide with an object that can then interact with these things. So let's make a bowl. Make a fast bowl. I'm just making a curve that I will revolve. Okay, good. History, freeze transformations, modeling menu set, surfaces, revolve. Let's give it some more segments in the revolution 16. We're going to output it as polygons. Anyway, I don't need to show you how to make a bowl. But of course, my always reverses it. It shows up black like this because it's inside out. So you select it, go to mesh display and reverse. Yay, that's good. Deletes history, freeze transformations, and then we'll smooth it. Okay. Couple of divisions. Right. History, freeze transformations. Good. Save your scene. Now, I'm working on a Mac instead of a PC today, so my buttons are reversed. So now, if we select the bowl and we go to FX to the bullet thing, now here we want to create a passive rigid body. And let's just leave it at the default settings. And we'll look at those in a minute. So now if we play the animation, okay, perfect, exactly what we'd expect. No, obviously not. So if we select this shape and go into the attribute editor, the rigid body shape, so body type, static body, yep, all this stuff, mass, blah, blah. Initial conditions, same thing, you can make it initially sleeping. Forces and impulse, yes. What we're interested in here is the collider properties. So again, it has to simplify the shape to speed up the collision calculation. So by default, the shape type is a box. Now, shape type is a box, it's not going to be able to approximate this shape at all. So we can change it to sphere, capsule, hull, mesh, which sounds good, plane, cylinder, compound, I don't know what those are. And we'll change it to mesh. You notice it says static only. Is that true? Maybe. Play the animation. Weird. It went down a little more, but it didn't quite go into the bowl. Why is that happening? Well, because we had it set as a box earlier, and there was an offset value in here. It's grayed out now, so we can't change it. But Maya just hasn't refit this properly. So there's a refit button. You click on that, it gets rid of that little value in there. Right? Now it's working properly. Why do we have to do that? I don't know. Maya. You can also turn off autofit too, and you can try and change some of these things. But just clicking refit seems to work. So now, in our other animation, we had this thing lift up and move and dump the stuff out. But this is a static body. And so that means you can't animate it. Well, you can animate it. You can go ahead and animate it if you want, but it's not going to carry these active rigid bodies with it. The only type of thing that can do that is a kinematic rigid body. Now, if you set this up initially, when you first created this thing, it wouldn't allow you to change the collider shape to mesh because it says static only. However, what I've found is that if you make it a static body first, change it to mesh, and then change it to a kinematic rigid body, you don't get a warning down here, and it works. I'm always afraid when things work. Okay, so let's say let them settle, and we'll stop here. Now if we go into the channel box, so here's my nicely named Revolve surface, that's my bowl. You notice that it's got an input in here. That's because it's receiving instructions from elsewhere because it's being treated as a rigid body. But you can animate these things still. So I'm just going to select all of these these attributes, and just set a keyframe. I can right click and say key selected. So you'll notice I've got a keyframe down here now. I'm going to play it out a little bit more. And then I will animate it going up. Don't worry that it leaves these behind. It's not solving because we don't have the playback head moving. And we will rotate this around. I'm going to move it up a little bit more. I've got auto keyframe turned on, so it's auto keyframing for me. So let's see if this works. Will it work? I don't know. So far, yes. Come on. Yes. There you go. The settling of these was a little bizarre, but it was pretty good, maybe because I moved it so quickly. But it seemed pretty realistic. A bowl dropping cubes. Great. I'm going to save this because it actually worked. I'm going to do one other thing, which will probably break everything. But let's say we want these to start in the bowl rather than falling into the bowl. We can play the animation and get to a point like this, let's say, and we can select, I think we have to select, what do we have to select? The cubes? What we want to do is set their initial state, right? So in the bullet menu, rigid sets, set initial state. Now if I go back to the beginning, yep, so you have to select the cubes, set their initial state once they've settled a little bit, and when you go back to the beginning of the timeline, they'll stay in that position. Now if we play the animation, they're still settling, still gravity. Now will the animation work? Come on. Yes. See, the kind of, they seem a little bizarre the way they're animating there, so let's save our scene and just try and change that. Let's try to change the internal fixed frame rate. Okay, come on. Come on. Is it any different? I have no idea. Let's try 240. Will it crash? It might. Come on, look at this tower about to topple. Come on, let's go. Yes. I don't know what's better. They all seem to work okay. And there you go. That's how you can drop some objects in another object and have that object drop those objects. Thanks.